Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to yet another fun lore hammering stream with a lore rather than law. This one was set up over on Discord. Discord? Oh, let's start as we intend to go on. I can't even speak English today. Let's start afresh. This one was set up over in Discord where we had a chat about different topics that we could discuss today before, well, Lindsay goes off and does all of her rookery streaming later on this evening and the computer's taken away from me. She's off at the gym just now, so I've got a bit of free time. And I'm going to be using that free time today to be discussing the Countess of Nuln, a subject that's quite close to my heart because it's a character that I have been using for not just years, but decades. And during the course of that, I have played so many different versions of her, some of which I sort of regret and wish I'd done differently, others of which I'm very proud of, others of which I will probably never do again, but were certainly fun at the time. This stream, though, is going to start off with discussing the character, where she came from, how she came about, and loosely, if you want to go check out the character and where she can be found in the various books, where you should go to do that. And I'm also going to discuss how she's expressed in our game, because I run an actual play of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay called LAWhammer, if you don't know, and I'll be surprised if you don't if you're popping by our stream. I will be discussing her version and how she'll express, and gently discussing where that could go in the future, but not too much, because the version of the Countess that I'm using inside LAWhammer is super close to the one that we were originally going to be using. Let me think, all the way back in the first version of our rewrites for The Enemy Within, back in about 2019, when Graham and I were discussing how we could conclude the whole campaign. So, first things first, where is Nuln? Who is this Countess? And what the hell is going on? As always, if you've got any questions, do feel free to pop them in the comments. I will not be paying a huge amount of attention to them, although obviously they do churn around in the corner. If any super chats come up, they will pop up to the top of the screen, so I will catch all of those, because even if they scroll by, they'll be just sitting there at the top of the screen. I can just press those buttons. So apologies if I miss any of your comments as I go, but for example, there are questions like this, and it was 2000, I'm not sure it was 2007. I will tell you a little bit about that, because the Countess, she coined a phrase in our game, and it was a phrase that a couple of years later was everywhere, and we felt kind of weirded out about it. And it was indeed shut the front door. But I'll get to that a little bit later as we discuss our versions of the Countess and how she might express. So first things first, Nuln is one of the primary cities in the Empire. It used to be the capital and was for a very long time. The capital has shifted about primary capital cities in the Empire at various points in its history. Nuln was for a long time the central capital, and what everyone believed was almost synonymous with the Empire. What we view as the capital nowadays, Altdorf, very much wasn't in the past. It was just one of many cities, and not a particularly large one at that, that held the imperial capital as its, let's say, held it in its armory, so to speak. Nuln was the capital that Magnus the Pious ruled from, and several emperors after him also ruled from Nuln. But before him, there were many, many more, and Nuln was the biggest city in the empire for many periods of the empire. So the city itself has a long and storied history and is one of the biggest places you can find. It's also a source of industry, a source of technical innovation, one could say. It's where the Engineers Guild has got some of its biggest offices. The biggest one is actually up in Altdorf, but more importantly, it's where you get most of the war machines of the Empire that, well, are successful, our various cannons et al. Now, there is a lot to discuss about Nuln. This thread is not about Nuln, but it's worth stating that the Countess, who is the current ruler of Nuln, if you are playing in the End Times, or if you're playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st through to 4th edition, or indeed Warhammer 4th through to 8th edition, that's the Warhammer Fantasy Battle game, you'll recognize her name as the Countess of Nuln. And she is, let's just say, a mercurial character. And I don't mean that as a descriptor for you to go, right, so the Countess is mercurial then. No, she's changeable in that the character of her has changed multiple times in the background, and it has made it difficult. Loosely speaking, we had a character that was portrayed one way, that changed to another, then changed to another over time. And each of those characters need to be rationalized in one way or another if you happen to be using her in one of your games, or if you want to do something like convert her over to Warhammer or convert her over to Total War or something similar for a mod. So, what do we have with the Countess of Nuln? Let's start at the very beginning. The Countess of Nuln was first, as I recall, popped in and clarified for her age, her heir, where she ruled, and everything else in the Enemy Within campaign all the way back in the late 1980s. So she is a character who has probably a longer life in Warhammer than almost any other. There are barely any characters who can be said to come from the modern version of Warhammer, as in anything from the late 80s onwards, that can be said to have had the not just life of the Countess, but continued presence of the Countess. Maybe Karl Franz, in terms of the actual impact, but very few others. The Countess of Nuln has pretty much always been there. There's been a host of other characters that were introduced at about the same time, but most of those vanished or were rewritten or were written older. The Countess, quite the opposite. From the 80s onwards, she's been there. And when I first played with her in a game, which was for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition, she did not have much of a character. She was not very well expressed. She was pretty much just a title, who she was, who her heirs were, and much later, a great deal more detail would be added. And I say much, it's only a few months to a few years later. But it's worth saying that to begin with, she was just one of many. And to call out the early 80s writers for something they did well with their version of the Empire, she was just one of many female rulers as well. The Empire was nowhere near as sexist as it would become in the Battle Edition, where they pretty much went, it's a men's game for men, and they all are men. And it was men everywhere across the Empire. One gigantic man fest. It was sausages everywhere. Indeed, that was such a thing that Sigmar's sausage became somewhat of a standing joke during the course of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition, because sausages everywhere, but not for the original writing of the Empire. For the original writing of the Empire, not only were there many female rulers, there were also many female heirs, and that set up an interesting situation. As time went by, the Countess got extra details, the most famous of which probably came from Kim Newman's books. Now, you may know Kim Newman if you've read any of the very old novels from Box Tree Books, as they were all the way back then. Kim Newman by the pseudonym Jack Yeovil, because that was the character name that he used for his books when he was writing for Warhammer. Indeed, a lot of early Warhammer books, they employed well-known writers who used pseudonyms, because I believe it was Brian Ansell, actually, who did the original calls, and he was very keen for the Warhammer world and 40k to be properly characterized by capable writers, good writers with established names in their field. That being the case, Kim Newman stepped in, and Kim Newman looked at Warhammer and saw it, as he's mentioned in more than one blog, as a great diversity of potential stories that could be told. So he started telling stories within the Warhammer world that conformed to movie genres, to be super, let's say, quick about what he did. So we had got ourselves the equivalent of a Western or a murder mystery, and so on. One of those stories was called Drachenfels, and the Countess featured squarely in that. And the Countess, it's fair to say, was a relatively venal character. She was obsessed with her appearance, obsessed with her age, obsessed with sleeping with other people, and broadly speaking, was a walking, talking stereotype amongst many stereotypes, because in many respects, that's what his books were doing. They were taking characters into a host of stereotypes, presenting the mysteries around them and allowing it to pop up. However, her character got much more detail in Beasts in Velvet. And Beasts in Velvet is, in many respects, the big one. Because Beasts in Velvet established the character further, much further than Drachenfels stated it, and added a brother, added a mother, indeed added an entire aspect to her character that was, let's say, exceedingly disfavorable. I don't want to ruin that book, because the book is actually brilliant. Sure, it takes some plot elements directly out of some very old movies, but I think that's part of the fun of it. Warhammer has always riffed upon these old things, and in many respects, it shows just how much Kim Newman was a movie buff. Even his main characters, like Detlef Serk, he's just a German director. Everything has been lifted up and dropped down for his books and repurposed and reused in other ways. You may know Kim Newman, for example, for his work for Empire magazine, where he works as a reviewer there for pretty much ever, reviewing movies, because he's a master movie buff. And the books books reflect an awful lot of that in his tone as he projects this version of the Countess. It is fair to say that she is not a good guy. And indeed, it's also fair to say that she's not a good leader. She is not the sort of person you would ever want to be in control of a grand province. And there's very little about her that can be said that is actively positive. Now, this bled into the roleplay version of her at the time, and the character became somewhat more of a stereotype as she was presented, until eventually she was loosely perceived by most people who were playing the game at the time to be a poor leader who was obsessed with Nuln and only Nuln, the city that she led. She was a party princess, for want of a better word. She was somewhat of an it girl and was arguably the most eligible bachelorette, I suppose, in all of the Empire, while simultaneously sleeping with literally everybody, making her both the most eligible and least eligible, depending upon who you listened to when they did their write-ups at the time. There was an awful lot of very heavy stereotypes being used for the Countess, and her general character was not a positive expression of almost anything. She was a walking, talking stereotype. Now, stereotypes are very useful for us to immediately understand characters, but for us to understand people and real people as they express in, say, a role-playing game, they don't necessarily make it the best start. However, as many of us know, Warhammer got changed, and I do mean changed a lot. Come the 4th edition of Warhammer, so we're now talking the early 90s, and this is the battle game. The 4th edition of Warhammer came along, and the Countess, unlike almost every other character from the role-playing game, was kept as one of the rulers. They created a whole bunch of other new Elector Counts that were ruling each of the provinces, and they kept Karl Franz also. This, at the time when the Empire Army List came out, was enormously controversial amongst a large section of the fan base. Now, admittedly, Games Workshop kind of didn't care, because they weren't selling to the established role-playing fan base. There was a bit of crossover for the Warhammer Fantasy Battle customers, but not a huge amount. The big market they were selling into was the battle game miniature painters, and they really didn't care about the changes at all in the slightest. Indeed, because as far as many of those were concerned, they presented more traditional battle leaders that left them with more options. However, the old Elector Counts, as everybody knew them for the 1st edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, were gone. On top of that, the stories that had been presented in The Enemy Within, which was the core campaign for that game, were also gone. Because you may not know this, but Karl Franz dies. Dead. In pretty much most playthroughs of The Enemy Within, nice way around, first way around. I just said nice way around there because I literally just saw the comment saying, nice sweater, thanks very much. So first time around, Karl Franz is a goner. So he shouldn't be sitting around on a big gigantic griffin, swinging his hammer around doing Sigmar things. Further, the Hammer of Sigmar, if Karl Franz is around, shouldn't be there. People are already beginning to be upset. All the Elector Counts have changed. They're getting even more upset. And the Elector Countess of Nuln is still there. That actually, believe it or not, was lauded by many. It was also called out at the time because she was now the only female Elector Countess in the Empire. And it made everybody go, what are they doing? I remember this discussion at the time because I was running my own games club at the time. So I must have been about 17. I'm taking a guess here. I was a kid and I had about 100 people that had come along every single week to my games club. And we had ourselves a bunch of games that we played, obviously huge, massive Warhammer games, often up to ridiculous level of points because there was a lot of us there. And I also had a shop where I sold all my stuff from this games club. Super fun times. And when the Empire Army List arrived, I remember looking through it and us all being utterly bewildered. It's like, what is this? They've basically turned the Empire into a simpler version and also one that appears to be deeply sexist in a way that it wasn't before. And I think it speaks to me as a young man that we all thought this, and all of us, there wasn't really the same. This was a club that was pretty much all boys, yet we still saw this. It was enough. We are aware enough to look at it and go, there's definitely been a change here. What's going on? And the Countess's character, to begin with, wasn't mentioned at all. But through the course of multiple White Dwarves, through the course of various stories that came later, it's fair to say the Countess began to diverge into two separate characters. because there's one thing you can say about the battle game is that they seem to want to make everyone super, super competent. They aren't happy with saying that someone is a relatively all right leader or is, kind of okay. They're generally always the best politician that ever moved the empire. Look at Karl Franz. Karl Franz in his first iteration was pretty pathetic, kind of useless, but they turned him into a superhero. And the Countess, over the course of multiple articles, was generally steered in exactly the same direction. The few mentions that they made of her were generally on the lines of childhood friend of Karl Franz. She leads from the south. She's truly astonishing. She's managed to bind all of the southern peoples together. The Countess of Nuln, she's great. But simultaneously, there was a host of novels, there was a host of other references which sort of suggested she wasn't. Where they went, the Countess has no idea how to lead at all. She's only interested in Nuln. She's somewhat of a party girl. That's really who the Countess is. And this strange direction split started to go further and further apart as her character became both more and more capable and equally less and less capable at the same time. And that didn't make a huge amount of sense. But it was all down to whomever the author was at the time. Just to give a single example. And again, this stream was 100% unprepared. So if I get any of my references wrong, please do correct me down in the comments and go make comments and say, dude, you got it wrong. But as I recall, the Countess gets herself a few lines at the end of Skavenslayer, Gotrek and Felix novel. And throughout the course of that book, the Countess is, broadly speaking, portrayed in a relatively negative fashion. She is someone who is, well, if I'm being fair, she's not exactly the best leader. She, well, how can I put it nicely? She's kind of lustful, incompetent, vapid, really not all there, not intelligent at all. But come the final lines of the book, they weren't that bad. Her speech wasn't the speech. Well, her speech, it was barely a speech. It was just a few words. But her additions to that book weren't that bad, but she was not a fine example of female representation in anything, or even a fine example of the character that had been hinted at. So we were again presented with almost two versions through the course of that book. And it's those two versions in some respects that will actually inspire me when I later write the character out and add extra detail to her for Rough Nights and Hard Days, which was this book, where the Countess of Nuln featured again. Through the course of the battle game, as we eventually reach all the way up to the 8th edition of the game, the Countess continues her two characters. And you'll find that this isn't uncommon in Warhammer, where different writers have only read 1 or 2 or 3 sources and haven't read all the sources. So you tend to find that they come in and they've got their preconceived notions for the thing that they read and they liked. And they go, no, it's this. And they start writing it. And then the next one comes along and says, no, you got it wrong. This source over here says it's that. And they write a slightly different version. And this is pretty much par for the course for the Countess, as it is also par for the course for a host of background material for Warhammer in particular, particularly when you move away from core characters like, for example, Karl Franz. Karl Franz got repurposed in the 4th edition of Warhammer, and all he has done is become more of a Superman since then. But up to that point, he was a far deeper, more varied character. So it's super interesting to see where the Countess sort of landed by the 8th edition of the game. By the 8th edition of the game, she is not really described as the party girl at all. Although there are many references where she is that, she is generally described as a competent leader, not a military person, who is capable. But even when we move into the end times, they kind of undermine that. She's in both the Glotkin book, as I recall, and the Horned Rat book, again, running from my memory here. And as I recall, she ended up bickering with the Elector Counts up in Altdorf after Nuln has been pretty much minced through the course of some of the more ridiculous events that happened during the end times. And she ends up bickering with other Elector Counts who frankly should know better. And if she was capable, the word bickering, which is again a somewhat loaded term, is not the one I would have preferred to use in that instance. So there's still hints of her character being one way or the other led all the way through it, but they again don't really pin down who she is, because to Games Workshop, she was not just a tertiary character, she was just someone who was named again and again, infrequently or frequently, depending upon the source or the story at hand, but certainly not a character they focused upon. because they largely focused on their men. Because men are men! And that leads us up to the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Now, the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is an interesting development process in and of itself. So at the point that the game was developed, Warhammer was dead. And by that I mean Warhammer Fantasy Battle had gone. We had no hint that the old world would one day come. We had ourselves some computer games that were in a very strong position, whether we're talking about Vermintide, which was selling bucket loads at the time, or alternatively Total War Warhammer, which was also at that point selling bucket loads, both of which didn't really worry too much about the Countess of Nuln, which meant that when I came in as the producer of Warhammer at that point, and I was given a choice as to how to create that character if we ever used it, I had a great swathe of different information to call from. And to say it was variable was to underestimate how much they conflicted with each other. I know I say that one a lot. To say it's this is to underestimate that, but really it was a lot of contradictory lore. And I didn't worry about it to begin with. I knew that I was going to be working on the Enemy Within at some point, and that she was going to be a primary character of that, at least in the Enemy Within as I envisioned it at that point. But I didn't know exactly what we were going to be doing with her. Then I became producer, and I was given a book where she was quite literally going to be a character potentially in it. And through conversations with Graham Davis, who was the author of said book, we decided we'd pop her in. And Graham wasn't doing any of the stats or indeed the NPC blocks at all. I was working on all of those because he and I worked together on the book. And the Countess of Nuln was one of the characters. And I had just very recently checked through what Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the 4th edition, offered. Now, you'd think I was a co-designer. I should know. I was. And much of the work in there is the work I wrote, but equally much of that work got changed slowly but surely over the course of editing. Some of it got changed in conversations with Cubicle 7 or with Games Workshop, and the rule set as it ended up is not the rule set that I wrote. It was a slightly different version, so I needed to figure it all out. And it's fair to say that the Countess that I built for this book here is a Countess that was built on my first fresh understandings of where the rules had landed. If I was building her again today, I again would build her differently. Some of it's really good, some of it less so. But the most important part for this stream is, who is she? I mean, who is she? Is she a party girl? Is she a super intelligent, perhaps sociopathic manipulator of everybody, be that men, women, or otherwise? Is she a competent leader? Is she a potentially brilliant leader? Is she just a fundamentally complex character, or is she something else? So the version that I wrote, and I'm going to read out a couple of bits of it just because it's worth defining it exactly, is what I felt was one of the best compromises that I could make. And some parts of that were specifically chosen because of the way that she'd been characterized in the past, because I didn't want to lose any of it if possible. I wanted all of the details to stand, so no matter which version of the Countess you may have used in your games or you wish to present in your games, you could do so. For example, over there somewhere, sitting up on one of my shelves, I have a conversion of the Countess of Nuln on a fucking war griffin because I could. No one's going to stop me. And whilst many people can deem that to be utter blasphemy, the Countess doesn't go to war. Any character under the correct circumstances can, and in my version of Nuln at that point, of course she could go to war, and I put her on a bloody griffin because I could. No reason why you can't. For your own armies, you can do whatever you want at home. The characters are there to inspire you to create your own stuff. They're not there to really limit you, particularly when it looks at the battle game where we're all building our own little armies that mean something to us. And there was just no other potential leader in the Empire at the time that wasn't a man. And gods, if I couldn't make her a general and a griffin, then who could? So I did. That's not, however, what I did for the version of the Countess that we presented in A Night at the Opera, which is one of the adventures that are sitting inside there. Oh, pardon me. We've had a super chat, so I shall just bring that one up. Hey, Cole! Say what you want about Paternal Scale Slayer, but the delusion why her chief Frieza sees her is hilarious. Yes, I think that's really nice. The delusional way that her chief of secret police, Fritz, sees her is indeed hilarious. And indeed, the standing jokes stand throughout, and I like them. Indeed, I didn't want to undermine that version of her because it was fun. So Here's the Countess, and the Countess that's presented in there was blonde, which went as a surprise for some who thought she may have been dark-haired, some who thought she was auburn. I actually got, it was actually fascinating. I got 3, maybe 4, 5, 6, let me see, over on Ratcatchers. Ratcatchers Guild is a Discord server for Fantasy Roleplay, the game. And I was on that pretty much every day when I was producer, because it was the game I was producing. So obviously I was over there. I very rarely visit nowadays. But over there, I must have got so many messages, and they all contradicted. It was hilarious. The Countess has got dark hair. Here's the source. No, the Countess has got brown hair. Here's the source. The Countess, why she got blonde hair? This source says it's different. And that is at the core of what I built for the character. It was absolutely essential. She could be all of those things while simultaneously not. And I purposely chose a hair color for the illustration. Worked on that one with Sam Manley. If you know Sam out there, Sam is brilliant. That was as direct a contrast as I could make to most of the existing versions of her, while simultaneously possibly being the true version of her. You'll find that the wiki at the moment almost certainly says the opposite. I'll probably say something like she has dark hair but dyed it blonde, where this particular case was she had blonde hair and she dyed it dark. Had dyed it dark. The whole idea was that the Countess herself was difficult to pin down. Anyway, looking over at the words, Countess of Nuln, widely known as just the Countess, this is something to point out. The Countess is not the Countess of Nuln. Strictly speaking, she is the Grand Countess of Nuln. That means she's an Elector Countess. But such is her position, such is her sway, that she drops the Grand because everybody already knows it. She basically inhabits the word Countess, even though there are countless Countesses all over the Empire, obviously. She is, however, a Countess of elsewhere, Meissen. Countess of Meissen, which is quite far down south and perhaps speaks to what many people describe as her prejudices to the people in the south. The Countess of Nuln, particularly the Grand Countess of Nuln title, came later with the help of Karl Franz. We'll get to that in a moment because I'm about to describe the little bit that we've got here. So she's a childhood friend of the Emperor. This was an established fact in multiple books, so I thought it was very important to reinforce this, particularly given what we intended to do with her in the Enemy Within campaign, the 4th edition rewrite of it, where the Countess was going to become a key character through the 4th and the 5th parts of the campaign. But I was no longer producer when those books were made. She was not the key character in the 4th and 5th parts of the campaign. Instead, she's an incidental character in the 5th part of the campaign, given some stuff to do, but not a great amount. She was originally going to be one of the core characters, one of the core NPCs, as part of the resolution to the whole The Enemy Within campaign situation. Anyway, moving on. The important part there was she was a childhood friend of the Emperor. Next, it's widely rumored to have had a relationship to guarantee her rise to power. Now, there's a couple of things here that are super important to reinforce. Number one, she's wildly rumored, and wild rumors are what circulate around the Countess. People pretty much love to transpose all of their thoughts, their hopes, their fears of what she might be onto her, because she herself is not necessarily the easiest to read, particularly because she herself is, to go back to the word that I used earlier, and perhaps an inappropriate one for Warhammer given its real world connotations with the god, mercurial. She is not a simple woman. And to make her a simple woman is to do her an extreme amount of disservice, I think. Not just because she is a leader of an entire grand province of the Empire, one of the most important people in the old world, but because falling into another tired stereotype for women when you have hardly any women in your setting already was, for me, an absolutely unacceptable conclusion. I wanted to have someone who felt like she lived, she breathed, and was a real person. And for me, that wasn't too hard to write because I've been using her as a character in various different ways, sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other, both competent and incompetent, both the version in Skaven Slayer sat aside the version that Warhammer had produced. I tried them all and realized that they were all a little bit too thin. None of them really spoke to a character. All of them were almost stereotypes that I could project for an NPC just so I understood them. So that's a non-player character, rather than being fully realized characters themselves. And in truth, she was pretty much all of that, as we will go on to. So, wildly rumored to have a relationship with the Emperor. And that's, yes, sex, people. We're talking sex. So we're talking the Emperor and the Countess when they were young, where, if I do say so myself, fucking. Now, for a lot of people, that's immediately weird, particularly because Karl Franz was given this bizarre character through the course of Warhammer where he was oddly sexless. Indeed, a lot of later Warhammer was both either A, oddly sexist, or B, over-sexual, depending on exactly on what models or what faction you were dealing with. But Karl Franz was never given a wife, never given kids, never given anything, even though the novels had hinted at a variety of relationships. For this version, we made it quite clear the Countess and him had, the Countess and the Emperor, pardon me, had almost certainly had some form of relationship at some point. And when they were young, we're talking proper young. We're talking when they were probably just before they were crowned in their various crowns. And it is that relationship that helped the Countess eventually gain the crown of Nuln as Grand Countess, not just the Countess. We will go on to this. So, known for her outrageous parties, I've lost track where I am. There we go. Known for her outrageous parties, scandalous style, and her many romances, she is reputed to be the most powerful and fashionable woman in the Empire, as well as the most beautiful and eligible. She's a whole lot of things, if we're rumored. Now, no, I didn't say she is these things. I said she's known for these things, because this is how the character is believed to be by most of the people in the Empire. And there's a reason for that. She hosts more parties than anyone else. Nuln is the cultural center of the Empire to the end times, pretty much. Altdorf is the capital, sure, but the cultural center stays in Nuln, and she's at the heart of it. Most of the best tailors and clothes makers and dressmakers, many of which had come over from Averland, are sited in Nuln. Nuln is the center of the court, other than Karl Franz. And it's important that we understand the extraordinarily important position that thus gives the Countess. Everyone comes to her every year during the courting seasons. As they're moving from courts to courts, they all go to Nuln. All the nobles gravitate back there. It's like a great star that everyone's sucked into in the middle of the Empire. Altdorf to the north is important for a host of other reasons, but a lot of them are trade, a lot of them are imperial politics, much of which the Emperor tries to hold on to very tightly to himself as the prime estates. We can talk about that in another stream if you want. Attempt to conflict with the Emperor, but a lot of the real shit happens down in Nuln, where all the nobles get together and they make decisions before they go back to Altdorf. Nuln is huge, and in turn, that means that the Countess, for whatever reason she's holding these parties, is surrounded by all of the gossip. She knows all of the things that are happening merely by the fact that she exists within this particular environment. Now, if you wish to portray her as someone who did that on purpose, you've got all the fuel there to do so. If you want to portray her as someone who is perhaps accidentally doing that because she's just interested in the parties, you've got all the fuel to do that too. If you want to make her both, as in she is someone who likes this particular lifestyle, but she is also exceedingly capable if she would only apply herself, you could also do that. And that perhaps is one of the more truer ways that you could think of her, that she is a complicated person. Everybody has things that they want to be, that they could be. It's only Karl Franz, who is written as the weirdest Superman known to man, who expresses everything perfectly. And having ourselves flawed characters who perhaps should be doing one thing, but are doing another until they are pressured into a different position, until they have an opportunity to grow and develop as a character and perhaps have their own character arc and become someone fresh and new, is, I think, much more interesting than just starting off with, this character was born brilliant, continued to be brilliant, and ended brilliant. The Countess, by comparison, is someone who was born into a difficult situation where her titles were weak. We can go on to that if anyone wants to know more about it. Got herself into a relationship with the would-be emperor. He became emperor. All of her titles were then consolidated. That relationship came to an end. Fascinating in and of itself. Why? Was it her choice? That's one way of resolving it. Was it the court of Altdorf's choice? That's another way of doing it. Young Emperor Karl Franz perhaps pushed away from the Countess to the south for their fear that Nuln may try to rise up and usurp power away from Altdorf. Was it Karl Franz himself who made that distance? There is no real answer to those questions because they haven't been answered. So you can answer them yourself for your own games. And until Games Workshop provide an answer and possibly rewrite it 1 or 2 years later and then rewrite it again 1 or 2 years later, there is no way to determine what the truth is. Let's move down, though, because there's more to say. Right, so she's known for all those things. Whispers of her wild temper, capricious nature, and her disdain for politics dog her every step. Now, I chose dogging her every step here on purpose, because much of this is actually to her detriment. This is not a good set of character traits. This is things that will mean that people will say the Countess is not someone that we want to work with. Her wild temper, her capricious nature, her inability to stick with a single plan and move on with it, her absolute disdain for politics, her desire not to be involved. Now, anyone that reads anything about the Countess can immediately see that her disdain for politics, it can't be true, because Visenland, let's just keep a simple story for you. To begin with, she rules the county of Nuln and Visenland. Visenland at this point is not the Visenland that we'll have in Warhammer 8. It's just a part of that. And during the course of the Enemy Within campaign, as is presented, more and more territory in the south is taken over. Sudenland, as we know it from the old world, eventually gets completely taken over by her city of Nuln. And Nuln takes over it all, and it all becomes the Grand County of Visenland, something she rules as much like the old elector position of Visenland in the past. And she comes to rule of all of pretty much Visenland and what was once Solent. She has one of the largest grand provinces in the empire given over to herself through the course of her own rule. To begin with, it was just the city of Nuln, and she was the Countess of Meissen down in Visenland and parts of what would be called Visenland. And she ends up ruling all of it, while somehow also being disdainful of politics, while somehow also being incapable, while somehow also being someone that nobody could trust. The reality of what she does in comparison to the rumor are two very different things. And I had to basically wind those two things together for her write-up. We had to both justify why she was perceived to be one thing and she was also another thing, because one thing can be certainly said. By the end of the Enemy Within campaign, and by the time we hit Warhammer 8, she is arguably the best politician in the Empire. She is the obvious wife for Karl Franz as it's presented inside Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and that's the second edition, and Warhammer 8. She quite clearly is extraordinary, but she wasn't to begin with, or she presented herself one way or another, or she is, certainly a complicated character. So we've got a character who has potentially an arc here, but importantly, she doesn't marry Karl Franz. She doesn't do many of the things that a character who was truly perfect could. And I think in many respects that speaks to her complicated character. In the same way that Karl Franz, if you look at a lot of his actions, they betray his description as a perfect politician. He simply isn't. He makes mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake, because whoever happened to be writing at the time basically said something like this: Karl Franz did this because it was his best option in front of him, so he did it. Unfortunately, that caused problems and it left the empire leaderless, or whatever you do. No, he simply made shit choices. He simply made very poor choices, and they wrapped it up in a wrapping of Karl Franz is brilliant. The truth of Karl Franz is he made many errors. In the same way that the Countess is allowed to make errors, and they say she makes errors, and they write her very differently. And I'm not saying that they're inherently sexist in their writing, but there does seem to be some unconscious bias going on with how they present her and their perfect emperor, because by the end, she is extraordinary in terms of what she's managed to do. Karl Franz has done nothing to expand the empire. He has done nothing to make it a better place. He has done very little other than consolidate the empire as one body that's not going to collapse into civil war as it did during his rule. His rule is dogged with issues from the beginning to the end, and the battle game keeps on either ignoring that or rewriting it so they can reestablish again his character as being perfect. Where the Countess tends to have a more complicated relationship with the writers of Warhammer, where she is both presented as either this capricious, strange character who can't be trusted and is only out for sex and parties, or alternatively, someone who managed to bind together one of the most fractured, broken provinces in the Empire underneath her rule, while simultaneously having everybody love her in her people, even though she's conquered half of them. It's an interesting story, particularly if you go over to the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and the book Forges of Nuln. That was a book written by Rob Schwalb. I did an editing pass on that for some mappy bits. It was a fun, absolutely fun book. Rob's great. And he presented the character of the Countess very much as he'd been presented in first edition Fantasy Roleplay. She's relatively lustful and vapid, and has absolutely no interest in politics. The boorish lords of the South have no interest to her at all. Yet it's also, through the course of that book, she's explained as someone who will and does indeed conquer everything. It's a bizarre dichotomy that doesn't quite make sense in that book. We will continue on, though. Right, moving down. People of all ranks emulate her. So we're already beginning to get an idea of who she is and what other people, for all they might be saying, she is vapid, she's this, they are emulating her. To curry favor or simply be like her, meaning her clothes, our choices for clothes, even when they're outlandish, are copied everywhere. That's across the empire. She's setting fashions. And that's one of the reasons we chose the ridiculous painting that we chose for her inside. If you take a look there, you can see the one that Sam and I put together. She is wearing a high fashion version of what many people would view as empire clothes, which are often a mixture of medieval and Renaissance clothes bunched together and then added with a couple of hammers, griffins, skulls, or equivalent. And this one, yeah, we had all of those things, but we also took out the front panel of the dress, left her with the bustle in place and everything falling back, and also dropped her down to just a very thin corset at the top, which massively undermined what many people viewed as the empire. We got more, not complaints, we got more questions about that outfit than we got from almost any other piece of art we did. We got more engagement on our posts. One of the older posts we had almost 150 comments within the first hour or so discussing it as to whether it could even exist. Which, of course, it could. Warhammer is so big, it's so deep, it has so many different versions. All of these things have got space for things like this, particularly when you view the high fantasy versions of what these particularly will express as. And the idea that Imperial fashion is just stuck in this bizarre real world copy-paste, photocopy situation, to me, is just mental. The Countess is going out of her way and to lead fashion, to lead conversation, to directly draw the eye, and to scandalize. It's part of the character she's presenting. Of that, there is no doubt at all. And if we look to real world varieties of how that expresses, we go to Hollywood, the equivalent of the similar style of glitterati. Look at some of the craziness they're wearing over there. At the time of me discussing this, we had a lovely one with Zendaya dressed up as a robot from the 1960s, an old outfit repurposed with naked bits of her body shining through all over the place. That is obviously not how most people dress. The Countess is not how most people dress. She is at the peak of imperial fashion and leading it in strange new directions. She is purposely made very tall in this version of her, so that when she puts on heels, she towers over everybody else. Again, talking to the old blood of perhaps the Azaborns or the Cherisons or whoever else might be running through her, depending on where you want to cite her bloodline originally having come from. And that allowed her to tower over the court that she was ruling. It was important to have that metaphorical aspect to her character, that for all she may be perceived as one thing or another thing, when she walked into the room, everybody couldn't help turn their head. She towered over almost everybody, particularly because she was a woman and she could, with her natural height, already do this. But once she was in heels, even Karl Franz was left looking up at her. And that was, again, an important point of trying to reinforce her character's presence, what she could do when she entered a room in comparison to some other people and exactly how they exuded. Karl Franz, in his later version, is almost like an ape with the way that he's described as being perfectly muscled and walking around like an Arnold Schwarzenegger wannabe, with his big, huge, broad chin and his perfect eye. He's almost a caricature of a real person. And the Countess, it was important to try and draw her out of that caricature where you would have naturally gone, oh, well, she's short and she's demure and she's a party girl and she's all these things. And everybody looks at her and just falls in love with her. Yeah, no, we had to have that idea that she was also an absolute ruler and capable of ruling as and where she had the desire to do so. But the big question with the Countess wasn't that. It wasn't could she rule, it's would she rule? Because she wasn't in a position to do so. And in many respects, not because she wasn't in a position, she was. She just didn't want to because she had a lifestyle she preferred. She had the intellect to do it, but she'd already got everything. There was no need to deploy it. And one of the core storylines we were presenting in The Enemy Within is, how do you motivate someone like the Countess to actually be everything that she could be? It's a very different story, for example, from Karl Franz. The story for him was, why is Karl Franz so rubbish when he becomes basically a god among men? What is the transition point between that version of Karl Franz and the new one? And that's the story I wanted to be telling for him. Indeed, each of the primary Electra counts, the stories for them were largely part of what the whole Enemy Within was about. I remember doing a big a speech down in Warhammer Fest where some of this was discussed, and explaining that the Enemy Within campaign was basically how can Warhammer First Edition, the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition version of the Empire, exist simultaneously with Warhammer, the 8th edition of the Fantasy Battle game, because most people think they are basically two different settings. And I said that the Enemy Within was that answer, and that was the answer that we were planning and building. I didn't execute it. So apologies to all of you out there who expect to find that in the Enemy Within. I left after the first book was done, so other people took over and they had a different story they were trying to tackle. For me, it was the story of the Empire. For me, it wasn't the story of what was happening in a variety of other places or those characters. It was very much the story of the Countess, the story of Karl Franz, the story of Gausser up to the north, the story of Todbringer sitting in Middenland, the story of Aldebrand Ludenhof over in Hochland, the story of all of these important people and how they became what they were, but also the story of the Empire itself, all the little people at the bottom that were turning to cults because of these people at the top, and how they could be motivated to be ultimately better people, or alternatively, the sort of people that lead to the end of the world, which is what the end times is. In many respects, you could argue that the Enemy Within campaign sets up the end times, because the characters, as presented in the Enemy Within, are what caused the end time to come to pass in some respects. So lots to consider there. I'll finish off this little description before I start thinking I need to move on to letting Lindsay take over the computer. She's going to be doing a stream with Andy Leask in around about, what time are we at? We're at the time of recording this, I'm just coming up to 6:20 UK time. They're streaming at 7 o'clock UK time. If you want to go over to the Rookery Publications page, and they're discussing how to take in fact, they're discussing something quite relevant to the subject everyone taught today, how to take a character, your own PC in a role-playing game, and make it interesting and fascinating and enjoyable to play. How to make people much more in depth and much more engaging than perhaps the stereotypes that many of us start off with when we start role-playing. I'm quite looking forward to seeing how that's all going to pan out. I'm going to be watching that one. I'm also rather pleased because Lindsay's normally the hostess over on Inside the Rookery, but she's not going to be hostessing. She's going to be getting interviewed this time by Andy Leask, and I think that's going to be super awesome. So yeah, do go check that out. But I'm going to go back to my little bit here before I carry on. So people of all ranks want to be like her, as we said. So Mia, here we go. Copied everywhere. Her softly spoken, refined accent with a gentle uplift is imitated. Now, this was purposely chosen for two reasons. The Nuln accent is defined quite clearly in Sigmar's Heirs. That's a book in 2nd edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is a Reichland accent with an uplift at the end, somewhat like a Valley Girl lift, if you know that, or what Australians do when they go up at the end. So, you know, they're a little bit upper class and they go up at the end. And so everything sounds a little bit like it might be a question. So the Nulner accent, it goes up at the end like that. And you might notice that this is also an accent that, not necessarily the upper class part, but the uplift at the end is something that is pretty much a thing that happens today across social media, where we have TikTok social influencers who are all going up at the end. That Valley Girl lift from California has infiltrated speech in that fashion. And the Countess is pretty much, in the Warhammer world, the originator of this, because her natural accent goes up at the end. And of course, she's much more refined and up here in terms of how she speaks, because she is absolute royalty of the Empire. But she goes up at the end. Whenever she says something, it sounds like it's a question. And again, that speaks to her character. That speaks to her as a person. It's a metaphor for everything that she is. Everything about her is questionable. Nobody is quite sure who she is. Is she that party girl? Many people fall in love with that party girl. Is she a competent ruler? Many people hope that she will be, and she gathers some of the best advisors the Empire has to offer, and they are around her. Did she do that on purpose? Did she not? Is she a sociopath who is manipulating everyone, or is he instead just somebody who could be brilliant but never quite achieves it? There's lots of potential answers, and purposefully, I avoided answering them when I wrote up this section. The point of this section was to create someone who could be whatever people wanted her to be, but simultaneously almost certainly was, A, capable of binding together all of Visenland, and B, being a party girl too. So we've got that. Her great love of music, culture, and extravagant entertainment sets the tone for Nuln, which it does. As an elect countess, she has the right to a runefang. Now, this is something that's important to note, because she has a runefang. The magical swords, we all know about runefangs. If you don't know about runefangs, go look them up. That's big magical swords made by Alaric the Mad, good 2,500 years or so earlier, and gifted to the Empire about 100 years after Sigmar was first crowned. And each of these runefangs were gifted to the tribal chiefs that became the companions or the elector counts to good old Sigmar himself. And these blades were distributed, each one crafted specifically for the clan, so all of them slightly different. And her one, Damis Vengrin, is a representation of that. Damis Vengrin being a representation of, interestingly, vengeance, an ability to take revenge upon those who cross you. And I think that's, again, speaks to her vindictive nature, her vindictive character that sits underneath it all, because at multiple times she clearly is vindictive. So that's not just represented in her description where she mentions she's one thing or she's another thing. It's also mentioned by the very sword that she bears, the very runefang that she can at any point bring to bear, but she doesn't wield it herself. She gives it to her generals. And I think that again speaks to her character. She doesn't do things herself. She has other people to do them for her. She is a classic noble. She's not the, might I also even say, ridiculous Warhammer leader that you normally expect, where they will be a special character on the front line. Now, for all I said earlier in the stream, I put my one on a griffin for fun. That was for fun. That was in no way a representation of who the Countess actually is. And I used an old vampire model for her because, well, the Lamian models were the only decent models at the time when I made that model that looked vaguely female. There is not an awful lot of choice out there. Hey, Sam Alden, thanks very much for the comment. Will she make a big appearance in LAWhammer? Yes. Sometime soon? Soonish. And does she have an important part to play? Oh, hell yes. For those of you who don't know, as I mentioned already, I'm doing an actual play of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in the Enemy Within campaign. That's the campaign that leads Warhammer from its 1st edition through to the 8th edition. It's also fair to say that my campaign is bonkers, over the top and crazy, but that's part of the fun of what we're doing. If I just presented the Enemy Within campaign as it was published or as anyone else has done it, there would be no interest in watching it. It would be the same thing that you could go and read at home if you bought the books. Yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm using the books as a point of inspiration and also telling the stories that I originally wanted to tell with the campaign, although I'll admit I'm going a bit over the top with most of them. But the Countess of Nuln is going to be central to our version of the Warhammer campaign par extraordinaire, I suppose. She is everything we have described so far. And I think that's what this version of the Countess was attempting to show. If you look at her stats, which are over on the next page, she is exceedingly competent if she wished to be. But just because you have stats that are competent doesn't mean that you are actually competent. I could have the very best charm in the world, for example, but if all I did was blow strawberries at people all the time, raspberries, pardon me, nobody would think I was charming in the slightest. You have to deploy it. And her story has always been, for me at least, what does it take to make her move? And for those of you who've watched Warhammer, I won't make any spoiler, but Lindsay mentioned this over in the spoiler section in the chat over on our Discord. In our version, she has very recently scored an advisor who has recently also been made to move, for want of a better description. And let's just say that's an advisor that is potentially going to change everything in terms of the potential outcome for the campaign, one way or the other. That's an advisor that's mentioned in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay core book, underneath the Cramond, as I recall, underneath the, I don't have the rulebook here, so I can't show you. I think it's the advisor career, where they are advising the Elector Count of Nuln. So that's before the Countess. Her father, Constantine, I think, is the one that's being possibly referenced. Her father, Constantine, was a relatively weak man who lost a lot of his power through his reign. His wife, by comparison, was an exceedingly strong woman who only got her own way. And if you ever read Beasts in Velvet, not only was she a strong woman, she was arguably a very bad woman as well in a variety of ways without being too judgmental. And much of that rubs off on the Countess. Much of who she becomes is because of that. But I didn't want to make the only female Elector Count in the Empire a walking, stalking stereotype and nothing more than her mother reimagined. It was important that she be given areas that she can, hey, oh, there we go. There's the advisor thing. Thanks very much, Lindsay. The small, I shall read this one out for you, actually. So this is the advisor to the Elector Count of Nuln. This is the same advisor that the Countess just picked up, Cramond, from R1. So it's just basically explaining how the votes lie and how the House of Third Wilhelm will flourish, and Karl Franz is almost certainly going to end up being ruler later. If you want to go read that, go check the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay book there. It'll explain it. So let's, given that we are now reaching slowly but surely towards 6:30, now I'm going to have to pass this computer over to Lindsay pretty soon so that she can go do her stream. Let's start doing some summations here. And if you've got any questions, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to our bits down there. In fact, let's bring up the one there from Hawk. Hey, Hawk. Tell us about the Shut the Front Door in 2004. No, 2007. Yeah, I missed this earlier. So, I've been using the Countess as a character in my games now for, well, I started in the late 80s. So since then, for longer than she's actually lived, which is ridiculous. And in about the early 2000s, the Countess, at one of her more extravagant parties, was making a comment concerning an event that had occurred. And she was stunned by it. And at the time, I didn't want to say shut the fuck up, because the environment had her being overheard. So she just simply went, well, shut the front door. And the weirdest thing happened. Lindsay thought it was hilarious as a comment. She couldn't help but laugh about it repeatedly. Shut the front door. What does that even mean? Her character taunted the Countess for saying it. So the Countess ended up saying it all the time, because she was that sort of person. And in turn, it became something that we sort of said. And then we started seeing it on TV. And we're like, this is independently grown somewhere else. And it started popping up in TV shows that we were watching. And we just looked at each other going, shut the front door. Fuck off. How is this even happening? What's going on? So much like she leads fashion in the Empire, apparently our version of her, at least to a small degree, has bled into the real world, even though we are almost certainly not the source of that. It felt like we were the source of that. I can't express to you how much it felt like it at the time, where we would constantly, Lindsay and I, look at each other whenever it came on TV and just go, yep, there's the Countess influencing the world again, being the Countess. So yeah, there you go. That explains that one. Richard, hey Richard, can you briefly explain titles and positions of power she and the Electors of Nuln have and how they've increased under her? I'll do this very briefly because it's something that is contradicted inside Games Workshop's own books. So it's not something I can provide a simple, definitive answer to and say it's this. What I can say for certainty is what I set up inside the books that I did write, so I can say what was there. And the Countess of Nuln became the Countess of Nuln, not the Grand Countess of Nuln, when she inherited. Her father had lost the electoral position through the course of his rule, and that electoral position had moved over to Visenland. And Visenland had, with their big council down in Visenburg, taken over control of that. Now, the Countess despised this because her mother despised this. And when she was young, there was just constant chat about how her father was basically a loser. And was incapable of keeping hold on to what is his. The deals that he had made with the Visenburg Council were unacceptable. The father, who was an intelligent man, was working politically in an attempt to try and keep everything together without it falling apart. It was going to turn to war. He was certainly someone who had screwed up a lot in his life. Now, we're playing the LAWhammer version. He had literally gone to war several times with mercenaries inside Visenburg and lost. He was in an exceedingly weak position. And that weak position had left him on the receiving end of almost certainly invasion into Nuln. And the compromise that they reached was no invasion. It goes back to Visenland, and Visenland becomes the electoral province, with the city-state of Nuln maintaining its independence while simultaneously no longer being one of the electoral provinces. If you look at the book War Enemy and Shadow's Companion, there's a breakdown between the difference between a grand province, which has an electoral vote, a province which doesn't have a vote at all and is almost certainly probably inside one of the grand provinces, and one of the prime estates, which is someone that can vote on imperial matters, a very important noble estate in the empire. All of the Reichland estates, if you read the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, are all prime estates, for example. So she, when she came to almost coming to rule, had Nuln as something that she could inherit, and she had Meissen down in the south as another one of the counties that she could inherit. There's a couple of things to say here, which I think is worth noting, because I think it's properly worth calling out. The Empire became, through the course of the 4th through to the 8th edition of Warhammer, an area where men tended to always rule first over women. And that can't be the case for Visenland, Nuln, et al. Not only did they start off with a woman chieftain, if you go all the way back and look at the original stories for the people who founded the area, but the Countess herself has got a brother, if you go by the standard stories that are presented. I won't go into that, but he doesn't inherit, which means it's oldest that inherits. Oldest in this case is her. So we already have a situation where in Visenland, women are going to be ruling definitely much more than they might do elsewhere. You could argue that all heirs are appointed. However, that's definitely undermined by pretty much all of the established lore that's presented everywhere except for in the original Enemy Within. In the very original Enemy Within, all of the imperial electoral positions have appointed heirs, not heirs that necessarily have it by right of blood. And I think that's something that was lost over the course of time, and I kind of wish had been returned. I asked to return it and got told that no, that's probably not the best idea, so I didn't return it when I did it. So she comes in as the ruler of Nuln and the ruler of Meissen. She's the Countess of Meissen down in the south, which means she has a vote on the Wissenberg Council, and she can speak as one of the people in Wissenberg, and equally she's up in Nuln, an independent city-state. Through the course of the years leading up to her taking the crown, everything sort of changes until eventually Karl Franz ratifies that the vote has moved, as in the imperial electorship, has moved from Wissenberg back to Nuln because it had been erroneously given to them in the first place. And he was asked to make a ruling upon it, returning it back to Nuln. A deeply controversial move, which again turns to warfare in the south, as Wissenberg goes up in arms, and deep to the south, Solon's old bloodline issues, which are now represented by Sudetenland. Sudetenland starts raising up as well, and there's a big long war that goes on. That war, under the rule of the Countess for the last 10 years, has completely changed. And Wissenland has changed its borders and pushed south into Sudetenland. Sudetenland no longer has the borders it used to at all and is getting slowly crushed. Its old capital is now deep into Wissenland territory. They still claim it's their capital, but it's now inside territory that has been both politically and martially taken over. Now, you might immediately go, so what? They're marching to civil war? No. They're marching lots of soldiers around, but it has never come to proper armed conflict yet. There's just been an awful lot of Cold War going on and territories getting swapped between different noble houses as Sudetenland and Wissenland, which now moves in accordance to the Countess's desires, go tete-a-tete. She somehow managed to get all of Wissenland, which her father had fallen out with, to turn all of their attention south down to Sudetenland, because she is, quite frankly, either brilliant or one of the most lucky people that have ever walked through a court. So, briefly speaking, she is now the Grand Countess of Nuln, which means that she has the elector count position, and she claims it as Nuln, not Wissenland. Wissenland is a subordinate province that Nuln rules, although it has a great deal of autonomy with its council, and down to the south, they're all at a cold, quiet war with Sudetenland, which its capital, Fildorf, is currently inside the current Wissenland borders. It's a big, complicated mess down there, but the Countess is slowly but surely creeping forward. And if you follow the events of the Enemy Within and move into Warhammer 8 later, she will eventually take all of Sudetenland and Wissenland, and will claim to be the Elector Countess of all Wissenland completely, eradicating the Wissenland Council, meaning that it no longer has any control at all, and it's why she took Wissenland as her effective title. But she still just calls herself the Countess, because in her own mind, she is the Countess of Nuln, her favourite city, and everything that is important to her. Whoa, that was quite a lot to go through there. So that was super fun. Let's bring up this one because it is an interesting question. How does the camera camera affect Wissenland and Nuln and the Countess? It's given rather short shrift in the book, actually, and I should have brought this one up a little bit earlier. Given the hour, I won't go into this any depth. Simply, they come up, Wissenland gets attacked, and the Countess does what the Countess does really well. And it's one of the examples of the Countess acting in a way that most people view as contrary to the character they think she should have. They think that she should be venal, incapable of ruling, relying on other people to do everything while she goes and has a party. Quite the opposite. She single-handedly took control of the military. She didn't lead them. She appointed people who were capable, and she spent, throwing gold at the issue. Lots of gold. Nuln has got a very long and deep relationship with the Dogs of War, as it is often called since Warhammer 5, Telia, where we have mercenary companies that come up. She's the first, and Nuln is generally described as the first to hire Nuln mercenaries to any great extent. And during the Tamarkan issue, there was a host of Tilian mercenaries brought in and mercenaries brought in from the rest of the Empire also. Cut a long story short, as is often the case with one-book campaigns, the impact that they have in the setting is far smaller than it probably should have, in that it should have been massive. because it tore all the way through the Border Princes and up and should have left a scar that took decades to heal. But instead, it being Warhammer, by the time we hit the end times, it's like it never really happened at all. And she's back to just being the Countess ruling over Nuln, and all of Visenland loves her, yet somehow she's also just a party girl that pays no attention to politics. So be aware that there's always going to be, in most of the sources you reach, and if you go read them all, you'll find that she's often given somewhat of a bipart character. And the rewrite of her was an attempt to say, yes, all of those things are true. She is a party girl. She is all those things, but she is also exceedingly intelligent. When she applies herself, she almost always comes out on top. But she doesn't have the great welling martial ambition that seems to sit at the heart of most Warhammer characters. She doesn't have this desire to conquer everyone. She just wants to bring everyone under heel that she believes to be hers. And most importantly, one character trait that does come up frequently is she's really vindictive. So if you cross her, she will crush you completely. And that's what happened to Visenland. She crushed it completely. And that is what motivated her, at least in that version of her. And then she just went back to being herself again, and everyone going, yeah, don't cross the Countess. Just don't do it. Not worth your time. You're going to come out on the wrong side, because she is so horrifically capable when she actually pushes herself. But most of the time, it appears at least, she does not. Right, so do we stop there? Unless anybody's got a last-minute question to pull up and it hits my inbox within about the next 10, 15 seconds, I will probably call it an end there. I have a couple of things to end on, though. One is, do go watch that stream with Lindsay if you're into your role-playing, because she's going to be throwing all manner of cool stuff, hopefully about Alamena with her character as well. If you're watching any LAWhammer, you'll be aware of that. Number two, if you haven't already signed up for this bad boy, the game that we're making with Mark Gibbons and Andy Chambers, you should. I'm going to actually drop a link for that, because you should all sign up for that. Hopefully that's in your comment section. If you're watching it later, I will drop it into the comments of YouTube. So if you're watching this a year later, that Dark Deeds page almost certainly won't exist, but the game will, so just go buy it. It's currently not in the shops, so you need to subscribe to get all the news for when it will be in the shops. So do please go over there, hit that subscribe button. It would be enormously appreciated. Even if you're not sure if you're going to go buy the game anyway, go hit subscribe anyway, because that makes a huge difference to us, because we're a tiny independent publisher. So every single last blip that comes in on a number tick makes an enormous difference for how well we think we're doing. But beyond that, I will sum with, the Countess is a complicated character. She has been portrayed as a terrible female stereotype who is basically out there for sex and parties. And it is badly expressed in many ways. But she's also been expressed, as the character developed over time, as a capable general, a capable war leader, and a capable administrator. Now, I did include general in there. That doesn't mean that she goes to war. It doesn't mean she leads armies from the front line, because she's a classic general sitting at the back, orchestrating with people who know how to make proper choices. She doesn't lead warfare like Karl Franz on a bloody griffin. She's sitting at the back. It's something that's always been missing from Warhammer that some other games have done better. If you take, for example, the Song in Ice and Fire war game, they have a whole host of characters who work behind the battlefield and can impact what happens on the battlefield because of their intelligence. Take Tyrion, for example, their ability to impact things that are happening out there, but they don't fight on the front line unless they have been politically manipulated into a terrible position. So she's not a frontline Warhammer character, but she quite clearly is stupendously capable. The question is, do you want to play one version of her or the other, or would you rather have a more complicated character who is both stupendously capable, but also at heart someone who just loves parties, who is loving her life, is surrounded by the worst that the Warhammer world has to offer, and has consolidated a rule that is unlike anyone else's, that is, in the greatest scheme of things, relatively safe. And of course, it gets attacked. Skaven come bubbling up from underneath Nuln, for example, or alternatively, Tamerkan comes in. And when they happen, she comes up and she ensures that her city stands, because her life is keeping that city in place. It's why when they told the end time story of Nuln pretty much being squashed without any thought, I was not just disappointed, I pretty much almost threw my fucking book away, because there has been a story being told about the love affair with Emmanuelle and Nuln, her city, throughout pretty much Warhammer, and not just spending even half a paragraph to give that tale not happy ending. It's the end of the world after all, but an ending that sings, that really speaks to the Countess and her love and what she would be willing to sacrifice so that Nuln stands. That should have been a part of the story at the end. Instead, what we got at the end was a story where Nuln is destroyed and she starts bickering with other Electrocounts because they didn't know what to do with her. And it's such a shame. She is a deep, complex, interesting character. And I think if you're out there thinking about including her in your games, you should. Think about how you want her to express, because there are 1,000 ways she could. And if you're thinking about, hey, I could make an interesting mod for Warhammer, go do so. Bring the Countess in. Do something interesting with her, because I think for Total War, she'd be a marvelous addition in a variety of ways. Total War is not just about who's on the battlefield, after all. There's lots of behind-the-scenes stuff going on, too. So whether you want to build her one way or build her another, I think she's a character that most certainly should be part of your games if you're playing in the Empire. And I think that's a really nice way to end. So thanks very much for turning up. You have all been absolutely awesome. Super thanks, of course, to those who threw super chats over. I do like to eat, so it's always nice to have a few extra pennies coming this way. Thanks, you all rock. Do watch out for extra LAWhammer streams. We stream every single Friday over on just Twitch when we stream our actual play. But we bring them out on Monday if you want to watch them over here on YouTube. We're well over 50 episodes or so of that. And we're just about to hit Middenheim in our game, where everything starts to change significantly in terms of the overall events. If you're people who've already played the Enemy Within campaign and you want to see how it could be played differently, do go check our streams out. It may not all be to your taste, because we go to some pretty crazy places. We take lore, let's say, liberties that other people will balk at. But everything that we've done has been done within the remit of what the lore presents, and is all possible. And that's part of the fun of playing games at home. There is no one out there saying you can or can't do a thing. And that's part of what our LAWhammer version of it all is. So, go sign up for my game. Do use the Countess. And do tune in for Lindsay in approximately 20 minutes, where you'll see her over on the Rookery channel. So if you haven't been there before, just type in Rookery Publications and you'll find all our Inside the Rookery stuff over on YouTube. And go follow over there. There'll already be a stream up there saying Lindsay's about to arrive. So yeah, that was super fun. Glad we did that. And for all of you that voted for the Countess, thanks very much. That was a good chat. We shall chat to you again next time. Bye-bye.